And so today, I want to talk about equity and economic development in the city of the future, and really kind of dig in and think about, what's happening out there, and also kind of give you a little bit of background on the research that we've done, the programming that we're doing on the ground. And so the way that I'm going to do this is go through 4 key areas. First being the future of work in cities, then thinking about the state of economic mobility, and cities and equitable economic development, and finally planning for the future. And so I think to begin, the way that we need to do this is to look to the past and to look at how we got to where we are right now. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, the majority of people worked in agriculture or were merchants. We've gone from all the way to there to now where we have autonomous vehicles and drones everywhere. And starting to think about, when I think about it, it's kind of like going from the horse and buggy to cars that can drive themselves in a little more than a century. And so now we are seeing these advances in information technology, advanced robotics, and artificial intelligence, and they're disrupting the relationship between capital and labor. And as these new technologies continue to rise, the gig economy, sharing economy platforms, and everything else, they're impacting the way that we do work and the way that we need to respond as economic developers and local officials. And so I think this chart kind of captures some of what's happening. Because we've seen a lot of data out there that says between 15 to 25% of work could be automated within just the next 10 to 15 years. And then when we go further afield, going out 20 years, we're looking at numbers like 47%. And I don't think that anybody really feels like all of these jobs are going to go away and new jobs won't arise. But there's going to be a transition period that happens. And during that transition period, it's incumbent on all of us, as well as local elected officials, state, national elected officials, to really think about what we can do to prepare for that future. And primarily, when we're thinking about economic development, it needs to be focused on people. As elected officials in the private sector work to craft a response to these vast changes taking place, it must prioritize people and put them first in order to be successful moving forward. And there's much work to be done. Obviously, coming from America, and I promise I won't share any alternative facts either, the wealth gap in America is enormous. We have the largest wealth gap in the world. And when you break it down by race, it gets even more stark. That when viewed through a racial equity lens, the gap between white and African American and Latino incomes has not only persisted, but has grown in the US. The wealth gap has more than tripled over the past 25 years and only appears to be growing. And it's not just us. When you look at OECD countries throughout the world, wealth inequality is quite high. And even here in Canada, it's a problem as well. And it's actually much higher than many Canadians think, and a far cry from what they think it should be. The top 10% of Canadians have captured 53% of all wealth in Canada, placing Canada 7th among all OECD countries. But what I always bring it back to is that cities drive the economy, both in the US, globally, here in Canada. In the US, these numbers show that cities contribute 91% of real GDP, 8% of real income, and $1.7 trillion invested annually. So this isn't small at all. And economic development is a top concern for cities, always has been, always will be. And our research, State of the City, shows this. We do this research every year. It's a content analysis of mayoral State of the City speeches. And every year, economic development is #1, and usually by a pretty wide margin. And majority of mayors say that they're focused on job creation. And due to rising inequality in cities from people moving there at rapid paces, cities are now focusing more on the role of equity in city economic development efforts. So what does this mean? And how are they doing that? Well, historically, cities have been addressing economic development through tax abatements and incentives. The best estimates in the US for state and local economic development incentives put the investment at somewhere between $50 and $80 billion annually, often with unclear or debatable successes. Each investment dollar at the local level should reflect investments that are benefiting the entire community, largely because traditional tools haven't always included all residents or areas of the city. And so this is one of the main reasons why we started to do our work on equitable economic development. It's important to note as well that each community is going to define what it means to be equitable differently. And this is a message we always convey at the National League of Cities, that local governments can really think these problems through, and they are able to come up with the best solutions. So, what does equity mean in cities? Kind of three key things we've looked at are that it unlocks the full potential of the local economy by dismantling barriers and expanding opportunities for low-income people and communities of color. Through accountable public actions and investment, it grows quality jobs and increases entrepreneurship, ownership, and wealth. And finally, it results in a stronger, more vibrant, and more competitive city. So to help in this effort, we launched this program last year, and we're working with 6 cities on an annual basis to really kind of dig in and figure out how we can help them with technical assistance. And the one-year fellowship focuses on these cities, giving them leadership development, peer learning, and sharing best practices. So our examples today may actually be radically different in population size, budget, or geographic area, but they're all targeting economic problems by addressing equity. So let's look at how different cities are approaching this. The first one I like to look at is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where they're preparing for the future of work. And Pittsburgh is a really fascinating city because they've really turned from kind of smokestacks to advanced industrial manufacturing. That now they're much focused on robots, autonomous vehicles, and everything going on at Carnegie Mellon. But Pittsburgh quickly industrialized throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. But in the 70s, as deindustrialization of American steel began, they lost 40% of their population between the 70s and 2000. But since 2000, they've been able to reverse that decline, growing by 40% and getting younger, and now boast a population over 300,000, and has been named the second best U.S. city for intergenerational economic mobility. So now they're able to bring in companies like Google, Uber, Apple, Bosch, and others, and these tech firms are generating $20.7 billion in annual payrolls. The city also has a renewed focus on one of the fastest growing sectors, healthcare. And this is critical because replacing that factory-centric economy are university and medical programs and hospitals that are creating jobs and new opportunities. Pittsburgh is preparing for the future, largely thanks to the grit of its residents, the support of its educational institutions, and the cooperation of its public officials. The next city we look at is a little closer to home, in Vancouver, British Columbia, where they're bringing about innovation through collaboration. So City Studio Vancouver is an innovation hub inside City Hall where city professional staff, university students, and community stakeholders co-create, design, and launch sustainability-focused projects. City Studio Vancouver tackles sustainability collaboratively, which is critical as climate change disproportionately impacts lower-income residents and communities of color. City Studio is also unique in that it engages students as leaders and decision makers, gaining insights and feedback from an often untapped resource, our young ones, resulting in innovative concepts for public art spaces, urban nature trails, and mobility. So now going south to Houston, Texas, where we see they're focused on serving the underserved. So the city of Houston is seeking to focus its economic development activities in the traditionally underserved communities located generally east of downtown, which have the highest levels of unemployment, lowest levels of income and educational attainment, and represent the highest needs for job and workforce-related programs in the city. The city is working to drive intentional development that considers the inevitability of gentrification and focuses on business attraction, retention, and expansion. So leaving Houston and going up the East Coast to Boston, Massachusetts, they're focused on neighborhoods. And in Boston, the fellowship program focused on small neighborhoods outside Central Business District with 3 primary goals. 1, to make the small business economy thrive. 2, to enhance neighborhood vibrancy. And 3, to foster economic and social inclusion and equity. And so from there, we go a little bit south down to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where I've done a lot of on-the-ground work with the Innovation District that they have there. And they're really seeking to close the digital divide in Gig City. So what's interesting about Chattanooga is it's also a post-industrial city that's been able to kind of punch above its weight for the Southeast, bringing in a lot of these tech companies, bringing in international investment. And what they want to do from the equitable standpoint is close the digital divide, increase that economic mobility, and think about ways that they can catalyze innovation within Chattanooga, resulting in the creation of that city's innovation district. And thinking about, traditionally innovation districts, whether that's Boston or elsewhere, haven't seen equity as one of the upfront goals. But Chattanooga is really trying to change that dynamic. And the final city that we'll look at is Charlotte, North Carolina. And if IADC can give a plug for their conference, our conference this fall is in Charlotte. So please, I hope you all can come. But what they're focused on in Charlotte is narrowing the economic mobility gap. So Charlotte is a fast-growing city with an increasingly large economic mobility gap. The city is focusing on 3 key components of equitable economic development. First, they want to build out their small business capacity. So through roundtables with small business stakeholders, focus groups, and surveys, Charlotte has redesigned their business resource website with interactive search tools and a greater emphasis on storytelling around small business success. And this is something we've seen in cities nationwide, this emphasis on storytelling, making sure that you're able to share that story and draw people in as a result of it. Second area they're looking at is workforce development. The city launched a new training and educational program with partners, including Goodwill Industries and the Urban League of Central Carolinas. And so some of those trainings include careers in broadband and fiber optics, residential and commercial construction, and highway construction. There's also a focus on youth talent development, including interview skills training and job readiness training. And finally, looking at policy considerations. The City Council is currently considering proposals around business investment grants and business corridor revitalization. So finally, really, partnerships and collaboration have been a critical component of making all of these efforts possible. So, it's not just in the US and Canada, but efforts like these can be found across the globe, and the need for more of them is urgent. We've seen some example of what tracks cities are taking through our fellowship and other means, but what can all cities do to prepare for these shifts? So here are some of the learnings that we found in our work. First, we think that you should focus on entrepreneurship over tax incentives. And what we mean by this is that city economic development officials can start by emphasizing economic gardening or growing existing businesses in their community and encouraging new entrepreneurship, especially in traditionally hard-to-reach minority and low-income parts of their community. Instead of using tax incentives to lure businesses from other cities, focusing on what's local and growing that. There's also a lot more direct and indirect economic and social benefit from growing businesses in your community than focusing on stealing them away from others, including a more efficient use of fiscal resources. Just one example of that, asking yourself the question, how many relocating businesses sign leases for more years than their tax abatements last? Oftentimes, they're just going to sign for that period. So once again, trying to think how we can build up what's great locally. Secondly, we think you should train and educate citizens for the workforce of tomorrow. And this is critical. As I've traveled around the globe talking to people about kind of what's going on within the workforce changes, this one right here is just so difficult because soft skills are some of those things that are so hard to train but are so critical, particularly as workforce are changing. But city economic development officials should also make this multi-sectoral as they're doing it and focus on bringing together major employers, businesses in high-growth sectors with regional workforce development and education partners to make sure citizens, and especially in neighborhoods and populations of need, are being trained and educated for the jobs being created in their city. The public sector can help broker and convene these discussions between parties that are not always aligned, especially in the rapidly changing global economy. So the third area that we would mention is to support local hiring, procurement, and supply chains. And so city economic development officials should also emphasize the value proposition of local procurement and supply chain relationships for both businesses and the community. Local procurement and hiring practices by major employers, especially place-based institutions like universities and hospitals, can have a huge economic impact in neighborhoods. And the fourth area would be to contract with minority and women-owned businesses. So city economic development officials should also lead on strengthening the city's own minority contracting requirements. So that doesn't mean just raising the goal for participation in publicly funded projects, but going beyond that. It means assessing whether current goals are being met and working directly with minority businesses to figure out how to help them build capacity to participate, as well as supporting minority entrepreneurship for new enterprises. So the sixth area, and we have 7 just in case you're curious, is invest in transportation infrastructure to build stronger connections. So on this one, and I think Canada does this a little bit better than we do, I would have to say, and a lot of it has to do with relationships between the local and national government, which have somewhat broken down in the US, as I think all of you can probably see, are that mobility options are fundamental to providing a robust platform for economic activity and human interaction within the urban environment in particular. It is imperative that cities allocate time to understand and weigh the costs and benefits of emerging technologies and developing mobility trends. And this is critical because technologies like autonomous vehicles and how they might link to public transportation systems really need to be thought of more and more. We did some recent research on this and looked at large US cities where only 6% of cities had actually delved in and thought about how these relationships might be built over time. So it gets back at this idea that technology is coming online so fast, and it's hard oftentimes for the public sector to kind of take that in and reflect on how it might work best. But finally, kind of cities must be deliberate in investments to ensure that they benefit all members of their communities. And this gets at that connectivity piece. Oftentimes, we see particularly public transit lines in US cities running in areas that are much more expensive, but not connecting those in communities of need. And so figuring out how we make those connections stronger is critical. And so number 7 is reinforce existing safety net and make changes for the future. And this also gets at some of the dynamics that play out differently here in Canada than in the US. Because in the US, cities have been the ones leading on many of these social safety net support systems in recent years, whether that be minimum wage or things like paid leave. But cities need to make several considerations as they evaluate and prepare a safety net to accommodate the workforce of the future. There will be a need to accommodate past prime and technologically displaced workers, so thinking about how we do that collectively is critical. And I think one of the other things that we've started to see some experiments both here in Canada and the US and globally are exploring things like basic income and more broad-based social support systems. So I think as I close out here, I spent a lot of this presentation discussing issues, but my parting message is that cities can and will prevail if we work together and plan for a brighter future. Taking a step back and seeing the progress of cities, there is much to point to. People have been flocking to major cities, and crime continues to be at near historic lows. Cities are leading on climate change initiatives, both in the US, Canada, and globally. And here I would say with partners at the national level, but in the US, they're just going it alone, and they're doing a great job still. Most cities are now also at their pre-recession revenue levels, stronger and more resilient than they were in 2007. And finally, cities are now seen as the laboratories of innovation, creating great ideas from the ground up. And ultimately, cities will lead the way toward a more prosperous and equitable future. Thank you all very much.